The bell above the shop door rang softly as he stepped inside, and before he could decide whether he should turn around or keep walking, the man behind the counter looked at him once, reached below the wood, and placed something small in the empty space between them, not pushing it forward and not saying a word, but leaving it there in a way that made the silence feel deliberate, as if the moment was no longer about what had been placed on the counter, but about whether he would take it at all. He had passed through the town before, always under the same loose supervision, always aware that the streets belonged to other people and that his presence in them would never feel natural. Yet stepping through the door of the shop changed the feeling completely, because the space inside was narrow, still, and carefully ordered, and the quiet arrangement of shelves, jars, folded paper, and stacked goods made him feel exposed in a way that the open road never had. Outside, he could keep moving and allow motion itself to hide his discomfort, but inside the shop there was nowhere for unease to go, and so it remained with him, visible in the way he stopped just past the doorway instead of approaching the counter like an ordinary customer. The shop owner did not greet him immediately, and that absence of speech made the room feel even smaller, because it removed the simple routine that might have guided the moment into something familiar, leaving the prisoner to stand in a place where he had not expected to be treated as either welcome or unwelcome, and that uncertainty held him still. His eyes moved slowly across the shelves, taking in the small details not because he wanted to buy anything, but because looking away from the man behind the counter was easier than deciding how to meet his gaze. Nothing in the shop suggested urgency, yet the stillness itself became a kind of pressure, because the longer he remained there without acting, the more noticeable his hesitation became, until leaving no longer felt simple and staying no longer felt accidental. By the time the shop owner finally moved, the silence had already shaped the moment into something larger than a brief stop in a small American town. Are you enjoying this deep dive? Most people don't know this side of the war. If you're one of the few who values true history, subscribe now and help us grow this archive. Without asking a question, without naming a price, and without treating the interaction as a sale, the shop owner bent slightly, reached beneath the counter, and brought up a small object wrapped in a way that concealed its exact form at first glance, then placed it carefully on the wooden surface between them, not close enough to count as a direct offering and not far enough to seem withdrawn, but exactly where it could be seen, considered, and either taken or left behind. The motion was calm, practiced, and strangely respectful, as if the man behind the counter understood that whatever happened next could not be hurried. The prisoner looked down at it, and what unsettled him was not the object itself, but the fact that no explanation followed. He had expected some practical reason for the gesture, some instruction, some comment, even a warning that would define the boundaries of the moment, yet none came, and in the absence of those ordinary signs, the small thing on the counter took on a weight that exceeded its size. It was no longer merely an item placed in front of him. It had become a choice presented without command, and that was precisely what made it difficult to understand. The shop owner left his hand resting on the counter for only a second longer, then withdrew it slowly, making it clear that he was not about to push the object toward him or insist on anything. The lack of insistence changed the atmosphere more than a spoken invitation would have, because it made refusal possible without confrontation and acceptance possible without permission, and the prisoner found himself unsettled by both options. He lifted his eyes once toward the man behind the counter, expecting something in his expression that might clarify the meaning of the gesture, but the only thing he found there was patience, and patience, in that moment, was harder to face than pressure would have been. He moved closer because remaining by the doorway had become impossible, and yet when he reached the counter, the distance that remained between his hand and the object seemed to matter more than the steps he had already taken. He stood there long enough for the silence to deepen again, his eyes fixed on the small thing that had been placed before him, aware that nothing physical prevented him from reaching out, and yet equally aware that doing so required a kind of action he had not been asked to perform on his own terms for a very long time. In the camp, movements were directed, routines were repeated, and decisions were narrowed until they resembled obedience more than choice. But here, in the stillness of the shop, the burden of deciding rested entirely with him, and the unfamiliarity of that burden held him motionless. For a moment, he considered stepping back and leaving the object exactly where it was, because walking away would restore the certainty of movement, and movement always felt easier than commitment. But the thought did not release him from the moment. The object had already been placed there. The offer had already taken shape, and departure now would not erase it. It would only become a response of its own, one that would remain with him as clearly as acceptance would. That realization kept him in place. His hand lifted slightly, then stopped before reaching the counter, and even that partial movement altered the room, because it showed that the hesitation was no longer abstract. The shop owner did not lean forward, did not encourage him, and did not rescue him from the difficulty of the moment by speaking. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, allowing the prisoner to confront the fact that nothing more would be given to make the choice easier. In that silence, hesitation changed from uncertainty into struggle, not with the object, but with the act of taking something freely when freedom itself no longer felt natural. The bell moved slightly behind him when the door opened again, and the arrival of another customer altered the balance of the room at once, not because the newcomer spoke, but because he paused just inside the entrance and took in the scene without comment, noticing the prisoner at the counter, the shop owner standing back, and the small object that remained untouched between them. Until that moment, the hesitation had belonged only to the two men already in the room, but the presence of a witness turned it into something visible, and visibility gave the pause a new kind of weight. The newcomer did not interrupt, perhaps because he sensed that something delicate was unfolding, yet his silence was not neutral. It sharpened the prisoner's awareness of how long he had stood there, how unusual his stillness had become, and how strange the situation must appear from the outside. What had begun as a private uncertainty now felt like a test of character played out in full view of someone who knew none of the history carried into that moment. The pressure did not come from judgment spoken aloud, but from the simple fact of being seen while unable to act. Sensing this shift, the shop owner stepped back half a pace, placing more space between himself and the counter, as if to make it absolutely clear that the choice was no longer connected to him. He had offered the moment and now removed himself from it, refusing to guide the ending. That small movement changed everything, because it left the prisoner alone not only with the object, but with the full meaning of what it represented. If he took it now, the act would be undeniably his. If he left it, that too would belong to him completely. The room held still around that truth, and for the first time since entering, he understood that the hardest part of the encounter was not the gesture itself, but the fact that no one else was going to complete it for him. When his hand moved again, it did so without the uncertainty of the first attempt, not because the decision had become easy, but because he had reached the point where delaying it any longer would only repeat the same struggle in a different form. His fingers extended slowly over the counter, stopped once as if confirming that nothing would interrupt him, then closed around the small object with a care that made the action feel larger than its size should have allowed. The instant contact was made, the silence in the room changed. Nothing visible shifted except the position of his hand, yet the moment that had held everyone still for so long finally resolved itself. He did not unwrap it immediately, and that detail mattered, because taking it was the decision, not discovering it. Whatever the object was, its meaning had already been established by the simple fact that he had accepted something given without command, payment, or explanation. The shop owner lowered his eyes briefly, not in triumph and not in relief, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood that the moment belonged to the other man now. The customer near the doorway remained still, no longer watching a hesitation, but its outcome. The prisoner held the object for a second longer at the counter, as if testing the reality of what he had done, then drew it toward himself and finally stepped back. The movement toward the door came naturally now, not hurried, not confused, but steady, and when he opened it, the bell rang again with the same simple sound as before, though it marked a different crossing. He left the shop carrying something small in his hand, yet the real change was not visible in the object itself. It lay in the fact that, for one brief moment in a place that was not his, he had answered silence with a choice of his own. Outside, the town continued exactly as it had before he entered, with the same road, the same light, and the same distant movement of ordinary life. Yet the return to that familiar scene no longer felt identical to the one that had brought him to the doorway. He walked at the same pace, under the same conditions, carrying the same visible identity the town would always see first, but now there was also the weight of something freely accepted resting in his hand, and that quiet fact altered the meaning of the afternoon more than any conversation could have done. Inside the shop, the counter stood empty again. The shelves remained in order, and the man behind them returned to his work without dramatizing what had happened, because the gesture had never asked for words to complete it. Its power came from the waiting, from the refusal to explain, and from the recognition that some moments can only become real when another person is allowed to meet them without pressure. By the time the street absorbed the prisoner back into its movement, the scene behind him had already returned to silence. Yet something in him had shifted permanently, not because of what he had been handed, but because, after all the routines that had shaped his days, he had finally reached out and taken something no one had forced him to take. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.